Psalm 110, our psalm today, is translated a little bit differently, you'll see, than some of the other psalms. That's because I translated it to convey some of the uncertainty of the Hebrew itself. This psalm is the most quoted psalm in the New Testament, particularly what's called the Epistle to the Hebrews, which is in the New Testament. It's not clear, even for the early church fathers, if it was written by Paul, which many do ascribe it. Others say that the quality of the Greek is more, early church fathers will say that the quality of the Greek is more formal than Paul's other writings, pointing to someone else. The Epistle of the Hebrews, it's not clear who the author is, and it's not clear who the audience is. It seems to be Jews in Jerusalem in the 1st, 2nd century. And it's a book of theology, of support, of staying true to Jesus as the Messiah, and it's largely a midrash of Psalm 110. Psalm 110 is quoted many other times in the New Testament, more again than any other psalm. And it will be used to prove much about Jesus as both Trinity, later on, the star above Bethlehem, the supplanting of Jewish law by an enduring priest. We'll return to that. But I will also point out, and this is where we're headed, and I have to pace myself, that this psalm for the rabbis, who are often aware of the Christian polemic with Psalm 110 as proof for Jesus as Lord, will have different interpretations. But what's interesting is there isn't only one possible focus. So some, like Rashi, the Talmud, and Nidarim, will say this is about Abraham. Of course, most will say it's about David. Some will say it's about the future Messiah. And so a short psalm that is uncertain in many of its phrases, allows for much interpretation, and historically has a lot of theological wallop. With that, there's so much more to say. One last thing, and then I'll show the psalm and read it. First, for the pshat, just what is the understanding of the psalm as presented. And that is, you'll see a name, Malki-Zedek. Now, Malki-Zedek is a name that appears only in one other place in the entire Bible, entire Tanakh. And that's Genesis 14, verses 18 to 20, which I'm also going to post just because who is this Malki-Zedek? Again, only mentioned once previously in the entire Bible, and will have a central role in the interpretation of this psalm. And for a lot of the Jewish translators, rather than translating Malki-Zedek as a name, which again does appear as a name, will simply translate it as my righteous king, which can also be understood as a title of a ruler of Jerusalem, just like Pharaoh is the title of the ruler of Egypt, rather than referring necessarily to a moment of biblical past. With that, hopefully I've created curiosity to see this short psalm. And you'll see I've done some things differently in my translation. Namely, normally I translate Yud He Vav He as Adonai. That's how in Hebrew it gets pronounced. It gets pronounced Adonai, which can mean my Lord or my master, rather than trying to pronounce the Yud He Vav He. But here, there is also the use of the Hebrew Adon and Adoni, and that will become one of those uncertainties of translation. So let me just first read the psalm, go through it with some kind of basic pointing out some of the artfulness, some of the nature of the translation challenge, and then I'll share the key question. Who is this psalm about? What does this psalm come to teach in its original context? And last, how is it meaningful for us? Entitled, in this case, Yud He Vav He to my Adon. And again, the word Adon means master. So in modern Hebrew, Mr. master is Adon, Adon Cohen, Mr. Cohen. But it can also, in the Bible, refer to authority. For David, a psalm, an oracle of Yud He Vav He to my Adon. Sit at my right until I make your enemies a stool for your feet. A scepter of your power, Yud He Vav He will send forth from Zion. Rule amidst your enemies. Your people will volunteer on your day of battle in splendors of holiness. From the womb of dawn, yours is the dew of your youth. Yahweh has sworn and will not regret. You are a kohen forever, upon my word of Malki-Zedek. Adonai is at your right, crushing kings on a day of God's fury. God will judge among the nations, filling with corpses, crushing head over a wide land. He will drink from the brook on the way, thereby elevating head. Now, again, you can feel that there's some missing words here, that there's unknowns. For instance, verse 7, he will drink from the brook on the way. Who is the he? Is it I kept it as a capital because it's at the beginning of the sentence. But I will tell you that the commentators are divided on whether the he is God or the human king. So that again is part of the challenge of Hebrew and translation of Hebrew. There are no capitalizations. So let me start from the beginning with one eye on the clock, because there is so much to unpack. For David a psalm. Now, for David a psalm can either mean that this was written and announced to David, or given as a gift. It can be in his honor, or it can be David himself writing the psalm. Unclear when it says Le David, for David. What is the context and the role of David? Ne'um Adonai la Adoni. And I translate as an oracle for Yud He Vav He. And again, it can be for my Adon or to my Adon. The word Ne'um, Adonai, a speech of God, occurs 170 times in Tanakh, but it's the only place in Psalms that this word phrase appears, Ne'um Adonai. There is another Ne'um in Psalms, only one other, but it's in reference to David's speech. Here the phrase, a speech of God, where it appears in Tanakh, which is again a much repeated word, is in God's speech to a prophet. It's usually put at the end of a oracle meaning a divine statement. And so this is unique for Psalms. Ne'um Adonai, this quality of word choice. We have seen repeatedly in Psalms moments in which God speaks. So that's not unique. Namely, the idea of an oracle is not unique to this psalm, but the phrases. And then the question is, an oracle of YHVH to my Adon. Now, that probably means that the person who is saying this is saying this either to David or about David in regard to an oracle. So God has spoken about David or to David. You'll see why that will become worthy of debate. To my Adon. Now, Adon in many Christian polemics will be a capital L. So an oracle of YHVH to my Lord. So that would mean that David hears an oracle in which he overhears God speaking to Jesus. That's how the New Testament will understand it. I'll pull back. I'll give a little bit more content to that later. But for the rabbis, this is a small a. This is a human king. And so much will ride back to the issue in Hebrew, there are no capitals. Is this oracle to my earthly king? Or, now again, I'm going to foreshadow, this will be used as proof of Trinity. That God, this aspect of God, is now speaking to the lesser God. But just because I don't want to lose it, now I'm going to fast forward. I hope to not get confusing. Stay with me. This phrase, Ne'um Adonai la'Adoni, in the Zohar, 13th century, YHVH is tiferet, the quality of God's masculine combination of kindness and gevura, allowing for tiferet, chesed and gevura, for harmony. Speaking, Adoni is Shechina. Shechina is the feminine aspect of God. So that this is, if you will, the Zohar, the Jewish mystical commentary, is largely about a unrequited love between Tiferet, the male component, and Shechina. And so that's what this will be about. Now, I pause, and I'll be now more focused on Pshat. But to say that the possibilities of interpretation are pretty wide when you read things allegorically or try to hyper literally read it as well. And so back to the text. Sit at my right until I make your enemies a stool for your feet. Now, sit at my right would be a place of authority. Again, this is God speaking to Adon. He says, sit at my right, and until I make your enemies a stool for your feet, which can be understood, is understood by some of the rabbis as saying, God is saying to King David, this is again the mainstream understanding, sit here at my right, next to me, and I will make your enemies a stool for your feet. That's an image of victory. You find it's kind of an archetype. In Egyptian murals, you'll find the Pharaoh with his feet on the necks of his enemies. You'll get that image of Joshua 10:24, in which Joshua will order his generals to place their feet on the necks of the 5 defeated kings. So it's a way of demonstrating vanquishing your enemy. I will now fast forward to Christian interpretation. This will be foreshadowing, according to later Christian commentators, Jesus being crucified. And therefore, his enemies become his footstool because he's high above them. So you can see the possibilities of interpretation. But the mainstream one is, sit at my right, meaning I give you authority. I will honor you. You're my right-hand man. The right is considered strength. And the question is, and again, obscurity, who's going to make the enemies? Who's going to do the fighting? So for many of the classic Jewish commentators, God is saying, I will do the fighting. You stay here. Now, verse 2, a scepter of your power. And mate is a staff. In the context, since we're talking about a king, it's also used for scepter. And I have a beautiful midrash. I'm going to share it. I don't know. I'm going to go off screen for just a second. I want to see if my teacher Jack is here or not. Is my friend Jack here? I don't see him yet. Okay, so I'm going back to screen. But here is one moment. All right. So here's a midrash regarding this mate, and I held on to it because of wanting to honor my friend Jack, because his Hebrew name is Yaakov. And there's a midrash. What is this mate of your power? So again, the possibilities of reading into it. It is said that this is the staff that's been with all the great leaders. Jacob used it to split the Jordan River. He's the first. My beloved Rabbi Jack. Genesis 13:11, in which Jacob describes how he crossed. This is before he gets ready to fight with the angel overnight. And he tells his life story. And he talks about how he split the Jordan River with his staff. Moses and Aaron then inherited that staff. David took it into battle against the Goliath, 1 Samuel 17:40, a mention of the staff. And it's the staff that will yet be used by King Messiah in the future. So any word, you can find other references in the Bible. A scepter of your power. So the staff was the symbol of power. Yahweh will send forth from Zion. That again is the city of David. It's also the city where Jesus would preach and where he would be crucified. Rule amidst your enemies. This is God giving to this king a statement of authority. I will give you, God says to this king, I will give you a scepter of power. I will send it from Zion, and you will rule against your enemies. Verse 3 is a statement that your people will support you, king. Your people will volunteer on your day of battle in splendors of holiness. From the womb of dawn, yours is the dew of your youth. Which is to say, again, what's clear and what's not clear. Your people will volunteer. That's the same phrase, Amcha Nidavot, that is used in the Song of Deborah, Judges 5:2. So there's an echo, again, of earlier text. But here, the statement, the conveyance is, you will be a king that your people will support. They will volunteer to do battle. And then this phrase, in the splendor of holiness. That too is ambiguous. Rabbi David Kimchi will say that that refers to Jerusalem on your day of battle, in Jerusalem, the splendor of holiness, the holiness being the temple. Other commentators will say it's the garb for holy war. So they will do battle as holy battle with the garb that signifies this is a holy war. And here, this obscurity, from the womb of dawn, yours is the dew of your youth. Now, as I mentioned, some will read this psalm like the Talmud, and Rashi and Radak will make reference to it as a psalm about Abraham. From the womb of dawn, yours is the dew of your youth. The immediate level is, you, king, no matter how old you get, will always be youthful. You will always be vigorous to do battle. That's verse 3. But there's a lot of play that will come into this. And the image of the dawn here will be used by later Christian commentators to point to the announcement of the Messiah by the star above Bethlehem. And we'll do this as, the star of dawn. Verse 4, Yahweh has sworn and will not regret. The word Yinachem is so poignant when it first appears in the Bible. This word Yinachem first appears in the Bible in the Genesis account, Genesis 6, in which God will say in verses 6 and 7 that God regretted having created the world. God starts the story of creation with such enthusiasm. Every day God looks and says it is good, but by the time that it gets to the end of chapter 6, God will say in verses 6 and 7, God regretted that he had made man on earth, and he was pained to his very core. God said, I will obliterate humanity that I created from the face of the earth, human, livestock, land animals, bird of the sky. Ve'enachem, I regret that I created them. So here's that same word, but here the statement is velo yinachem, I will not regret, I will not renege, I will not retract, meaning this will be eternal. Your kingship will be eternal. For the rabbis, that will point to proof that David's descendants, his children, will continue as king. And now, again, in obscurity, verse 4b, you are a kohen forever, upon my word of Malki-Zedek. Now, you are a kohen forever. Normally, a king in the Bible was not a kohen. The only exception which will occur after the Bible in the book of Maccabees is Shimon HaTzadik, one of those Maccabee rulers. And the Maccabees, again, the sons of the priest Mattathias, hold on to kind of this dual power. The only one who would exercise it is Shimon HaTzadik. But that's a break. In the Bible itself, a kohen, a priest, is not a king. So the New Testament commentators will make a lot out of this, like again in the Epistle of Hebrews. And they will say, Jesus is the king, is the priest, even before even before Aaron. He's the eternal priest. And again, in Christian polemics, as a result, you no longer need the earthly priest. You no longer need physical offerings. You have Jesus as the eternal priest. But for the rabbis, you are a kohen forever has a very different understanding. And they will point to where the word kohen is used elsewhere in the Bible to refer, for instance, to King David's sons as those who are dedicated to God, meaning not literally the role of priest, but an appellation of power of dedicated service to God. So, ambiguity. You are a kohen forever upon my word of Malki-Zedek. And now a word about Malki-Zedek. I did something which I regret, which is I had things posted that are no longer there in my share screen. So because of that, I'm going to have to read to you a little bit about Malki-Zedek. Malki-Zedek is Genesis 14, verses 18 to 20. And here's what it says about Malki-Zedek. Malki-Zedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine. This is Abraham right after going to battle and defeating 4 kings, is part of a coalition to help, in David's case, liberate his nephew Lot. Malki-Zedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine. He was a priest to God the Most High. He blessed Abram, and said, "Blessed be Abram to God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth." And Malki-Zedek blessed God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Abraham then gave 1/10 of everything. So Malki-Zedek is both a king and a priest of Salem. We've seen Salem also in Psalms referred to as Yerushalayim. So back to our text. You are a kohen forever upon my word of Malki-Zedek. So here's how this is understood. A lot of the translators, as I noted earlier, simply say it literally. Malki means my king of righteousness. So you are a kohen forever upon my word of my king of righteousness. Elsewhere, King David is called righteous. So again, mainstream Jewish, you are my devoted servant, i.e. kohen, upon my word, as I pledge that you will be forever with me because you are a righteous king. Or referring back to Malki-Zedek as quoted in the Bible, you will be the ruler of Jerusalem. That is the historical reference. And now, 5, 6, and 7, and I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to go over just a few minutes today. Adonai is at your right. And now it's a switch. It's a switcheroo. Because before, God said to the Adon, you sit at my right. Now Adonai is at your right. It's like switching, which could be understood poetically. Right of a fighter is your strength, meaning God is at your right hand. God is your strength. So if you read this metaphorically, in the Talmud, they'll play with it to say that God would put the Messiah on one side and King David on the other, crushing kings on a day of God's fury. So now there's a battle getting ready to take place. And in this battle, God will prove essential. God will judge among the nations, filling with corpses, crushing head over a wide land. Filling with corpses, there will be so many vanquished, there won't be time to bury them. Over an expansive area, crushing head, which can also is translated as splitting of head. And again, that's the war. Those are the kinds of languages of ancient texts in battle, that you will be totally, you will vanquish your enemy, will be strewn across the battlefield. And this last verse, he will drink from the brook on the way, thereby elevating head. Or he will drink from the brook on the way, thereby causing his head to be elevated. So who is this referring to? As I noted in the beginning, you'll get Robert Alter and Benjamin Siegel saying it's referring to God metaphorically as the warrior. And there will be some that will interpret this, like Martin Cohen, as what is the brook on the way? It's the flowing of blood. Again, a very strong image of so great will the victory be. Their blood will flow like a river. An elevating head means you will stand victorious. The other way it can be understood is that this human king who's going into battle will drink from water on the way and then go into battle with confidence, with an elevated head, that God will have taken care of him. So let me read, because I'm now short on time. One moment. A very important excerpt. And again, I kind of messed around a little. I apologize. I'm going to turn off this for a moment so I get to see you. And that is, listen to this from the book of Matthew. Hear the echo of Psalm 110. Jesus is on trial before the Sanhedrin. And in the trial, the high priest, chapter 26, says to Jesus, I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. To which Jesus replies, you have said so, but I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, quote, he has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look now, you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? So this image that Jesus answers the charge is, again, ambiguous, but he will say, I will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One, which is an echo or pointing to this psalm, the opening verse of Psalm 110. And again, that opening verse will be repeated in book after book of the New Testament. So I'm out of time, but I'll pull this together with some thoughts. First is, as I noted, the rabbis will interpret who this psalm is about in multiple ways. Rashi, Gersonides, Ralbag, Radak will say this is in reference to King David. Abraham is also acknowledged by Rashi and Radak as a possibility, picking up on the Talmud. And they say this is an ode by King David to Abraham, hence Malki-Zedek, greeting Abraham after victory. Abraham, who is called Adon by the sons of Chet in Genesis 23:5. Abraham, who will be the one from whom the priests will emerge. They will be descendants of Abraham. And the other possibility that this is about a future King Messiah. That's the position Sforno takes in Italy in the 15th and 16th century. And now back to Jesus. This will become used as a proof text to prove for Jews that God has appointed an everlasting priest as God's right Lord, an extension. And again, this will be the most quoted psalm in the New Testament. An epistle of Hebrews used as a polemic to prove that Jesus is the Lord, is the Messiah who will replace the temple, and will point to Trinity, because God, has to his right Jesus and to the left the Holy Spirit. And so all will be found, and even in later commentators, other images of this being evidence of Immaculate Conception, of the star over heaven, all being derived from Psalm 110. So a closing thought before I turn it over to your reactions. There are many articles, if you Google Psalm 110, and one of them that I read was by Rabbi Ben Zion Kravitz, who is well known to me. He is somebody who has written a lot about and against those who would try and convert Jews. And he looks at Psalm 110 and tries to disprove that it's about Jesus, asserting that it's about David. And for him, a key is this word Adon is used twice. Once it clearly refers to God, and so the other time it clearly, when it says my Adon, and he says that's the proof that this is not Lord with a capital L in the other case. But here's my smile and to pull it together. Rabbi Kravitz does not, in this lengthy article, does not present other rabbinic understandings of this psalm. He does not, he just says it's not Jesus, it's David. Here's the proof that it's David. But he ignores the fact that the rabbis also, like the Talmud in Nidarim 32a, read this as an ode by David for Abraham, or Sforno, an ode by David describing the future Messiah, which is to say, I honor my Christian neighbors. I do not object to them reading Psalm 110 as an expression, allegorically, of Jesus. That's a possibility of interpretation. Just like you can read this as about Abraham or David. You have choices in reading poetry, particularly when we're dealing with allegories. I don't feel a need to disprove their reading. I simply say it's not my reading. As a Jew, I have alternative readings that feel to me more meaningful. I say that because it's important for me. Ahuva is not with us today, but Ahuva has given me confidence as a translator because she's so deeply learned in Bible to say, for every word, there are possible different interpretations, different translations, not just one. With that said, what does this psalm mean to me? This is a psalm, first that Martin Cohen, first Benjamin Siegel, his understanding of the psalm, and then mine. Benjamin Siegel says, this psalm is a polemic. It's written by King David or for King David, but not to be read to King David, to be read to the people or of another king identified with King David, saying, the priests may challenge my power, other kings may challenge my power, but God has declared that I am the king, the one who will both rule from generation to generation and will have the power to appoint the priests. and so that it's a polemic. That's Benjamin Siegel's understanding of this psalm in historical context. It's written to support King David. But going forward, where we read a psalm out of context, I read this psalm as a word of support, that in times of challenge, we can see ourselves called to be God's servants, to live a life of purpose, and that God will empower us to, one, believe in that others will support our mission of being loyal to God, and that those who are enemies in that mission will be defeated, because we will move forward feeling the confidence that our purpose, our mission, is right and righteous. And so this is militaristic in ways that, can be discomforting. There are too many crushed heads in this psalm, and the possibility of rivers of blood. At the same time, I choose to step back from that and to see that as allegory. And in that regard, Psalm 110 remains short, only 7 verses, and a reminder on a religious level to read my text with humility and yet be able to choose to read text as a source of confidence and service in how I live my life. So with that, some reactions. There's, of course, so much more to say. I'm going to allow Irene to be the first, though, because Irene is speaking. Here's a piece of a tidbit of English history for Irene. Oliver Cromwell, this was his favorite psalm, and he had his army sing it going into battle against the Scots. Wow. Psalm 110. Okay, go ahead, Irene.
Oliver Cromwell thought he was Moses or Gideon, and he allowed the Jews back into England, so we like him. And the Scots don't like us very much anymore. And Scot-free has nothing to do with Scott. If you wouldn't mind telling your friend that's President Biden, it's nothing to do with scat, which is Swedish for tax. Right. I had to teach this psalm to a number of clergy, so I was really interested to hear what you said. And my view is as follows, and I wonder what a Hoover would think. I'm also a translator. The vowels used for that word with Adon is Adoni, which, as you said, in modern Hebrew, it means Mr. I mean, if it was about Hashem, sorry, I don't use the Yod K, Vav K. If it meant, God, it would have different vowels, as you know. And when I was teaching this, and I was teaching from a Jewish point of view, they wanted me to say it was about Jesus and the Trinity. And all I can say to you is you're very lucky in California if the fact there are Christians that have a different interpretation are so tolerant, because they use this in our country, in the UK, also sometimes in Israel, both small countries, as a stick to beat us. A stick to beat us. I mean, they wanted me to say not it was an alternative translation, that it could be what you said, Abraham, or just somebody next to the guy in the service. They wanted me to say that it's the Trinity, and I couldn't walk out. I was being taped, and it's shocking. And there was another psalm, I think it's 22, similarly. And I've sent you my article written on the period of Lent that we're now in, the Christian period of Lent, with the former Archbishop of Canterbury. And we've just said this is used, the Psalms are used in the Church of England, which is still a very important church, as a stick to beat us. And the Archbishop of Canterbury has said publicly that the Psalms are all about Jesus. He hasn't said that's how some people interpreted it. And he hasn't said, like you, that there are different interpretations. If it's just poetry and it doesn't matter how you interpret, that's fine. And I agree with you about translation. Unfortunately, maybe California is so liberal that anything goes, but it's being used increasingly in this country. And I'm going to write an article about Easter. This is the first time it would have been done with the same Rowan Williams, because it is a real problem. They're using the person of Jesus as a way to demonize Jews. One example is we can't have the Seder because of lockdown, but they can have Easter and Ramadan. We're opening up on the 29th of March after the second day. So we can't have it with the family. And we are not listed on the census in England, but all other groups, without exception, about 20 ethnic groups are mentioned on the census form. So I'm not going to fill it in. So what I'm trying to say is you're nice, but other people are not. I'd just like to know about Christians in California. Sorry.
So it's okay, Irene. That's always your contributions is always much valued by all of us. I just want to underscore the key point you're making, Irene, and that is that there are those in the Christian world historically who used Psalm 110 as a stick to beat Jews. It, as I noted, is the most commonly quoted psalm in the New Testament. It is used throughout the New Testament as the proof that Jesus is seated next to God and that he is the eternal priest. And therefore, these earthly kings, these earthly priests have now been supplanted by the eternal king and priest. And that is, the most valuable takeaway of our study today of Psalm 110 is that this central psalm, which Christians and Jews share by having the same scripture, can be used, has been used as only one way of reading it and as a proof text to delegitimize the other. And that we as readers of the text, just within the Jewish tradition alone, can teach and know that there is no such thing as such a proof text, that these texts are poetry where there is no certainty as to what and who is being referred to, let alone to use it as a stick. But that's a very important piece of our learning together. Mark, did you want to? No, just the movement. Anybody else reactions to Psalm? And I think, Deidre, it's nice to have Deidre Robinson with us. I'll just read. If we wanted more certainty, we looked at Torah, not the poetry of Tehillim. And even there, Deidre, I will emphasize that the rabbis understand the Bible, the 5 books of Moses, as subject to even contradictory interpretations, so Nachmanides would teach, and that there isn't only one literal understanding even of the 5 books of Moses. Hence, the Talmud is a debate. Other reactions to Psalm 110? Howard.
How about you alluded to that there was a separation at a particular time between the priests and the kings?
Yeah.
Is this foreshadowing on certain levels, the separation between church and state?
Yes. So that also gives me 2 thoughts. You already find in the Bible, back to Deidre's comment about the Bible, Moses' brother, Aaron, becomes the priest, and Moses steps away from that role after inaugurating Aaron as priest. And that creates a precedent where Joshua, Moses' successor, is political and not spiritual in his authority and role. And that will continue. And one of the reasons that historians say that the rabbis were bothered by the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, is that they were from a priestly clan who then became the priests, and they said that's a taboo, which is one reason perhaps that Hanukkah does not get discussed in the Mishnah, the earlier rabbinic writings. Those rabbis of the Second Temple still had this sense of discomfort with the Maccabees, who became not only priest rulers, but had become corrupt. And so separation of powers. Though the other piece to share, Howard, is that this expression of God saying to the Adon, the king, sit at my right hand, would be quoted later by the European kings to demonstrate the divine right of kings. So they would point to Psalm 110 to say, I'm a king who sits next to God. I am above the rest of you earthlings. Other comments or questions about Psalm 110? Take one more before pulling it together. Anybody? All right, so let me just say one more important interpretation. Let me show you one last one, and then I'll pull it together. Share screen. Verse 6. 1 second. God will judge among the nations, filling with corpses, crushing head, al eretz rabbah, over a land rabbah. Here I translated as wide. Rabbah means many. Malbim, classic translator, Middle Ages, later. Malbim is later. He's Russia. He will say, this is a psalm by King David in honor of General Yoav's victory over Ammon. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 26 to 31. Here are three proofs. What is the capital of Ammon? The last word of verse 6, Rabbah. So crushing head over a land of Rabbah. In that description of Ammon, the capital is Rabbah. One of the paths to victory was capturing the sources of water, hence verse 7. And in this battle, King David stayed back. He was an older king. And so he sits next to God while the battle takes place. Hence, here is one other possibility. Psalm 110, according to Malbim, is a poem by King David celebrating his general Yoav's victory over Ammon. Again, I pull it together to honor how, and I say it with due humility, you can take words and read into a text a larger story. That's okay. That's the nature of personalizing a text. That is fine. The danger, as Irene pointed out, is that when a text is only given one interpretation and is used as a club to disprove other people's interpretations, that's already literally dangerous. Literally, Jews have died with Psalm 110 being raised as the discrediting of the old Israel by the new Israel, of a priest that endures, and that's a caution. And yet, that history, for me, needs also to be put aside in order to reclaim Psalm 110 as a psalm that transcends history, as a psalm that's an allegory, not a literal. I mean, in its historical context, maybe King David used this as propaganda to say, you see, there's an oracle, a proclamation, God speaking, saying that I am the king that will endure, that I am the servant of God, like Malki-Zedek, who was the priest ruler over Jerusalem. So it is, my scepter will come from Jerusalem. Again, possibly, but allegorically also. This is a psalm about acknowledging that there is a need at times for struggle, and that in struggling in life, to see oneself as with God at one's right hand and God calling you toward God's right side, and seeing one's life as a life of service, that one will prove successful, will prove victorious. closing comment before Kaddish, which I need to pull up again since I somehow got rid of it. And that is my beloved teacher, Jack Reamer, is honoring his brother and the end of Shloshim. Jack Reamer is, for me, an inspiration of Torah learning. He just had his 92nd birthday. His mind is totally engaged and engaging. The sermons and classes he's conducting, he lives in Boca Raton, are spellbinding. And that's because he's always teaching with excitement. That's because he continues to learn and share things that for him are new, even at his age, built on a foundation of learning. And so with Psalm 110, may we return to it. May we return to all our psalm learning with a foundation of the past and with fresh eyes to find in it new reasons to feel elevated and inspired.